All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to our continuing author interview series with the Civil War Institute. My name is Cameron Sowers and I am a fellow here at the Civil War Institute. Today I am very excited to be joined by historian Hampton Newsome. We're going to be talking about his most recent book, The Fight for the Old North State, the Civil War in North Carolina, January to May of 1864. It's available now from the University of Press of Kansas. I definitely recommend going and getting your hands on this book. It's gotten a lot of wonderful acclaim, including winning the 2020 Richard Barksdale Harwell Book Award from the Atlanta Civil War Roundtable, which is given annually by the Atlanta Civil War Roundtable for the best book on a Civil War subject. So this is definitely one that you should all have on your reading lists if you guys don't already. I'll probably put in the video a link for people to go to the press and check out the book. So, Mr. Newsome, I want to start off by asking you, what was your inspiration to write this book? Was there a source that you stumbled on that gave you a light bulb moment, kind of an aha idea? Or I'm just curious the process to getting this, because I know I personally don't think a whole lot about 1864 North Carolina. To me, at that point, I'm really thinking like overland campaign to Petersburg. So I'm curious about the genesis of this project.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are, I was the same way, 1864, North Carolina, nothing can really be going on there. With my book projects that I've done, I try to look for interesting topics that haven't really been covered in a lot of detail. Obviously, scholars have done work on this area. But also something that's going to make a nice kind of narrative history, kind of tells a story and would make it, a good book length project. And for this one, the tip came from a veteran researcher in DC, Bryce Suderow. And he has lots of ideas for lots of different things. And, I asked him I had finished a book I did on Grant's Sixth Offensive at Petersburg, Richmond must fall. And I was, looking around for another thing to do. And he said, well, why don't you look at George Pickett's expedition against New Bern in 1864? And I thought, well, what was that? So I started looking into it, gathering sources, reading about it, and realized this New Bern expedition, as they called it, was really part of a bigger campaign that was kicked off by Robert E. Lee in January of 1864 to send troops down to North Carolina and try to recapture the federal bases that were down there, like New Bern and Plymouth and Washington, places like that. And in doing that, Lee was really looking to open up those areas for supply for his troops. He had a real supply crisis at the time, but there was also a political element to it. At the time in 1863 and then 1864, there was this growing peace movement in North Carolina. And the governor at the time, the Confederate governor Zebulon Vance, was actually being challenged by someone who was calling for a peace convention. And there was kind of this, the Unionists, lots of Unionists in North Carolina, but they were very dispersed throughout a lot of the war. But this peace movement was kind of gaining traction. And so it just was a really interesting story to me on the military side. And, it's a military study. Most of it involves battles and things like that. But there are a lot of interesting things, ironclads, combined operations, these battles at New Bern, the battle at Plymouth. And so I was really intrigued by it. So in the end, I was happy with, what I could find and how it came together. Into one single story that has some things, in it that a lot of people may not really know about, but it's also connected to the larger war that's going on at the time.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned in there that I was surprised by, or I wasn't necessarily expecting, was really the link between these military affairs and what's going on politically in North Carolina. I had heard of Governor Vance. I know that, like, of the Confederate governors, I think he's one of the ones people might be more familiar with. but I'm just wondering if you could give a little more background on how you got, or talk about the use of politics in a military history, because you certainly do cover the military history element, but you talk a lot about kind of the social context of what's going on and 1864's political situation and the Unionists that are throughout North Carolina. I'm curious what their experience was like and how that fits into the military story.
Yeah, well, I think that's an important thing whenever, when you're looking at, kind of a book about battles, a book about military events. To me, the question I'm always asking is, I'm interested primarily in, what's going on the field, but why are they doing this? Is there any reason, non-military reason that's influencing this? And in North Carolina, Vance was a constant critic of the Confederate government in Richmond. He was always squabbling with them, but he was ultimately very much a Confederate nationalist and supported the war and the Confederacy. And so there was this newspaper editor, William Holden, in North Carolina, who began to, he was originally a secessionist, supported the war, but he began to have second thoughts, and not necessarily because he wanted to end the war and slavery, but he in fact felt that the best chance for the Confederacy to hold on to preserve slavery was actually to negotiate an end to the war. And so a lot of these people in North Carolina that were kind of part of this peace movement were really focused on that. They thought that if the war went to a military end, that they would lose everything that they had been fighting for. So, there's that aspect to it. But there's also in North Carolina's incredibly, like all places, very complicated. There are lots of issues going on. You've got the Unionists, you've got the federal forces are recruiting. They're recruiting white units with men from North Carolina, and they're recruiting African-American units with men from North Carolina, self-emancipated enslaved people who make their way from the local countryside into these federal enclaves. Now, the federal presence in North Carolina, just to give a tiny bit of background, that Ambrose Burnside, early in the war in 1862, conducted an offensive in North Carolina and managed to capture most of the key locations on the coast. So that's why you have this federal presence there. These bases, the main base was at New Bern. They're poised to very close to one of the main Confederate supply arteries, the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad that connected Wilmington up to Virginia. And one of the things in the book that I talk about is how the Union commanders never really took advantage of that lodgment. But that lodgment in Eastern North Carolina created incredible social and political upheaval. And so you see that throughout all these operations that I have, this snapshot in 1864. But there are so many things going on. I found it fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the figures that you've mentioned so far, I think are people that our audience might not be familiar with for what they have relating to North Carolina. Someone like Ambrose Burnside and George Pickett. To me, living in Gettysburg, to think about George Pickett on a day that's not July 3rd, 1863, was really interesting. So I'm wondering if you could just kind of give like a teaser for what George Pickett's doing in North Carolina in '64.
So after Gettysburg, George Pickett is given command of basically the Department of North Carolina for the Confederacy, and also the area in Southern Virginia. And he's based in Petersburg. And so when Robert E. Lee in early January thinks up this plan to go after New Bern and take the federal base there to get the supplies, the command for this operation goes to Pickett. Now, Pickett hasn't really done a lot since Gettysburg during this time, and he's also this is his first opportunity at independent command. And down in New Bern, and I won't get into all the details, it's a very complicated operation, not very well known, 5 different prongs. There's also a cutting out expedition and naval component to it. but it doesn't go well, and Pickett is very distraught by it, and ends up essentially failing, and then gets himself involved with these executions at Kinston that we can talk a little bit about. But eventually these operations in North Carolina are ongoing throughout February, March, April. There are some raids, there this kind of thing. But when the next offensive is planned in Richmond to go after Plymouth after the Newbern expedition fails, Pickett is not given the role. It's handed to this young North Carolina General Robert Hoke, and Pickett is kind of shoved aside. He later, just a month or two later, in defending Petersburg, kind of has a breakdown while he's there. And there are a lot of unflattering quotes in the book from a reporter who's with Pickett at Newbern, and the conclusion I got was that Pickett in this element was kind of out of his depth, and he was kind of overwhelmed by it, and very, very thin-skinned and not very tactful with people he was dealing with, and he ended up ultimately failing, during this period.
Yeah, you mentioned the Kinston Hangings, which I want you to cover that. That'll be my next question, because as I was reading this, and this is a book where, as I came in with, I'll admit, no background knowledge, I was learning something new on every page. This to me was one of those incidents where I was really stunned about what's going on, and kind of changes, adds a new level of perspective to me about what's going on in 1864. So I'm curious if you could tell briefly the story of the Kinston Hangings.
Sure. So during that Newbern expedition, when Pickett and Hoke and other members of his command attacked Newbern, for most part, it's a failure, but they do manage to capture this one outpost called Beech Grove. And Beech Grove contained a company of the white North Carolina soldiers that were in a federal unit. These soldiers were generally called the Buffaloes, and nobody's quite sure where that nickname comes from. But this company of Buffaloes is captured and taken back to Kinston, which is kind of the forward Confederate base in the area where Pickett launched his offensive. But it turns out that many of these men in this federal unit, these North Carolinians in this federal unit, were in fact in North Carolina Confederate units earlier in the war. And these units that they were in were kind of local bridge guards and local militia kind of, and they were, many of them deserted those units when those units were going to join the Confederate, were going to become a Confederate regiment. And so our North Carolina regiment. And so they left, and many of them found themselves, they went to the federal bases and they enlisted in the federal unit. So you basically have these men that have switched sides. On the way back to Kinston, it's discovered that some of these men are among the prisoners. There are tribunals held. There are several executions. Pickett is very, the evidence is that Pickett is very aggressive about this issue. And so about 22 men are executed. And it's generally, the episode's generally called the Kinston Hangings. And there's been, I'm not the first person to write about this. There's been good work by Leslie Gordon and Donald Collins. Gerard Patterson has a book on this episode. But it is very interesting. For me, the angle that I found interesting was Pickett's decision to be so aggressive here, because here he is in North Carolina. He's trying to gain victory, to gain supplies for Lee, but he's also there to kind of boost morale and boost support for the Confederacy. And many of these men, they were very poor local men that were executed. And many of the locals felt like they were they had joined these earlier units with the understanding that they would stay near their homes, and that didn't happen. And so they moved to the Union side. And so there was some sympathy for them. So one of my questions was, well, was this really the best decision for Pickett to execute these men? After the war, there were some investigations about it. Pickett actually, he moved to Canada to avoid problems with the federal government. Ultimately, he felt he was pardoned through a general amnesty in 1868. But it's one of those things that just shows the complication, how the war in North Carolina was much more. There was much more there than a lot of people will think when they're just looking at battles and things like that.
Yeah, as I read through this section, I was really thinking about, we oftentimes will talk about soldiers enlisting for duties protecting home and what that means for them. And this to me was an interesting layer for soldiers about how home was kind of an animating force. And another incident and thing you get into the book is interactions or maybe executions between, or when USCTs come into contact with Robert Hoke's men. Again, another one of these incidents where and for someone like me, I'm really interested in USCTs, but most of the time when we talk about their involvement, it's maybe somewhere at Milliken's Bend, the crater, Fort Pillow. So I'm curious if you could talk about USCTs in North Carolina and this troubling incident with Robert Hoke's men.
Yeah, sure. So the Battle of Plymouth happens in April, and as I mentioned, Hoke is given command, and he takes 3 brigades to this federal enclave on the Roanoke River. And there's a battle there. The Confederate ironclad Albemarle shows up, clears out the U.S. Navy from it's protecting the works at Plymouth, and Hoke his forces ultimately capture Plymouth. And after the battle, there are reports start appearing in newspapers and letters, rumors head up north that there is that the Confederates murder African-American prisoners after the battle. And at the time, there's no federal investigation like there were for some of the similar incidents that occurred. What was happening in Plymouth, there were no USCT units stationed there in the garrison, but places like Plymouth and Washington, North Carolina, and New Bern were very large recruiting stations for USCT units. So there were at least recruiting officers from at least 4 regiments in Plymouth. And so at the time of the attack, there were more than 200 of these new recruits that had just come in there in the garrison, and they stood in the trenches with the rest of the Union soldiers. And these were the men that were targeted. Now, for years after the war, there was a continuing controversy about what exactly happened. There are different accounts. The best study, there was a study done in the 1990s by Weymouth Jordan and Gerald Thomas that kind of went through a lot of the accounts. And they concluded that at least 50 men were murdered after the battle. Now there appear to be 2 incidents. One, there were men who escaped into the swamp, and the Confederates went after them, and there were some of them were killed then under very murky circumstances. And then there appears to be another incident where the men were just executed on the wharf at Plymouth. But that was the conclusion that Jordan and Thomas came to. I found some additional sources. I found nothing to question their conclusions. When you look at the various sources, you see a wide range of the number of men that were killed. One thing that I found interesting is that this incident fits into a pattern. So during that time, you've got Illusti, you've got Fort Pillow, which only happened a couple of weeks before. The units involved at Plymouth, one of the Confederate units was involved in a very small engagement at Suffolk, which is also in the book. And during that time, they openly admitted in letters home that they had executed some of the African-American cavalrymen that were there in Suffolk at the time. And then, you know, over the summer, at least in Virginia, you've got the crater, and then in the fall, incidents like Fort Gilmore and also the 9 Mile Road, which was in my other book. One thing that there's been lots of scholarship on this. One thing that I don't know if anyone's ever looked at, and I think would be an interesting question, is going through and systematically cataloging the engagements where the USCTs met Confederate forces and some of the USCTs were captured, and what happened in each of those incidents. You know, that's an idea for someone, I guess, to tackle.
One other thing that I want to get out of you in the interview, because this was a book where where military history, I think, really shined through, and in a unique way, was the combined arms operations, I guess you would call it, of the military and the Navy working together. And there was a chapter in here that I read it, and I had to go back through and read it a second time because it was not Civil War combat as I had thought of it. And this is the attempts to take the ship the Underwriter. So I'm curious if you could tell that story, because to me, that was really not how I thought of Civil War navies being used.
Sure. One of the interesting aspects of these events was this whole idea of combined operations, and in fact the Battle of Plymouth, with the Confederate Albemarle coming down the ironclad and coordinating with Hope, that's one of the very few instances of Confederate combined operations during the war. You usually, when you're talking about this, you're usually thinking of Union operations off the coast and that kind of thing. Well, at Newbern, there was also a similar coordination between Pickett and his force that he brings down, and the naval arm, so led by a guy named John Taylor Wood, who happened to be President Davis's nephew. So Lee and Davis in early January, they're talking about this operation against New Bern. These ironclads had been incubating in North Carolina up the rivers from these federal bases. The Confederates have been building them for years, but unfortunately for Davis and Lee, they were not ready in January. Now, the Albemarle was ready 4 months later, but they weren't ready in January. So as a substitute for the ironclad, and the ironclad above New Bern was called the Noose at Kinston. But as a substitute for the Noose, they decided to tap John Taylor Wood and have him take some Marines down and Confederate sailors stationed mostly in Richmond, take a bunch of launches, a bunch of rowboats down, and do what they call a cutting out expedition, which is to take the boats and find an unwary gunboat in the river and capture it. And for the expedition's success, this is very important, because one of the key advantages that Union forces have in Eastern North Carolina is they have naval superiority throughout the network of sounds and rivers and that kind of thing. And so if the Confederates can somehow neutralize that advantage by taking a gunboat and maybe turning it against the other gunboats that are there, then this would be a huge benefit to Pickett and substantially increases the chances of a victory at New Bern. And so what happens is Wood takes the train down. They put the boats on the train down from Richmond. One of the witnesses says it looks a little bit like a circus going through all these towns with these men in these boats on the railroad. They get to Kinston, they drag the boats down to the river. They take the boats down the Noose River to New Bern. They get there the first night and they row around. It's very dark, and they row all around New Bern. New Bern's on kind of a point where you've got the Noose and the Trent River, a lot of water around it, and they don't see anything that first night, which is incredible to me. But the gunboats that they're looking for are elsewhere. So they go back to an island and they stay there for the night, and they wait the whole next day because they can't do this during daytime. It would just not work. All this time, Pickett and his force are attacking, and the things are happening on land there. And the second night they go out and they find this Union gunboat called the Underwriter. Now, the Underwriter was a converted tugboat from New York, and it was actually one of the larger vessels there at Newbern. And they row in the middle of the night, and they get the jump on the Underwriter. And after a very short clash, they capture it, and they're all set to go and take the Underwriter and go down to Morehead City or find the other gunboats. But they can't, for some reason, they can't get the anchor up, and they can't break the chain. They can't find tools to break the chain. And they're sitting there. The Underwriter is moored right there on the wharf in Newbern, right very close to the Union fortifications. And eventually the Union, the men in the Union fortifications figure out what's happening, and they start firing on the Underwriter. Wood and his men have to leave. They leave the Underwriter there. It essentially sinks. And that's the end of the Underwriter thing. It's very successful until it wasn't. And so Wood and his men head back to the island, and just like a lot of the other things during Pickett's expedition, some very interesting things happen, some very almost kind of incidents for the Confederates, including this one. But that's what happened with the Underwriter. And apparently the boiler of the Underwriter was there in the water for decades after the war. So.
It was one of those stories. As I read it, I was like, I had a moment where I was like, I felt like I was reading like a Pirates of the Caribbean novel or something, that I just had a hard time when I think about Civil War navies, like the Monitor and the Merrimack firing at each other. That's what I think of, or maybe Vicksburg. And then the idea to me of Jefferson Davis's nephew going out with guys in rowboats and taking a vessel, to me was a really interesting idea. And so this is just a brief look into the fight for the Old North State, Hampton Newsome's latest book. It's with the University of Kansas Press. I recommend checking it out. It is a wonderful piece of military history with some great insights into what's going on in North Carolina in 1864. So pick up a copy and be sure to continue to tune in to our social media pages, our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, as we upload interviews with authors and other historians about what their work is and what's going on right now in the field of Civil War history. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in.